In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As you'll see, I've called this talk a cloud of witnesses, St. Aelred of Rievaulx. The notion of the cloud of witnesses is not original to me. There's at least one book about the writings of the saints which has that title, and it originally, of course, comes from the letter to the Hebrews, where it's really talking about the example that those, particularly those undergoing persecution, should draw from others in similar positions, from others in the church. Well, in the last chapter of his rules, St. Benedict, with, I think, characteristic humility, observes that not every observance of righteousness, whatever that means, is laid down in this rule. If it had been you or I, we might have been tempted to have a pretension to being the all-knowing source of wisdom about the monastic life or whatever else, and that all of the good sort of ideas came from us, but not St. Benedict. St. Benedict says he's not the be-all and end-all of monastic teaching. So if that's true, what is he suggesting? Well, he says we could look, for instance, to the pages of the Old and New Testament. And I've done various talks so far on Lectio Divina, and no doubt others too have done such talks. It's tremendously important for us in the monastic life, or in any sort of life which is inspired by the rule of St. Benedict, to have this way of allowing the Lord to speak to us and thereby for developing a close relationship with him in prayer. But the other thing St. Benedict points us to in this chapter of the rule is what he calls the Holy Catholic Fathers, their writings. And he particularly mentions St. Basil by name, and by inference, St. John Cassian. He talks about the institutes and the conferences of their fathers. Well, the institutes and the conferences were written by St. John Cassian. Why does he mention those figures? I suppose he mentions them because his own monastic life didn't fall out of heaven, like mine, like that of all the brethren here, and frankly like that of all of the monks and nuns in any monastery. It comes from somewhere else. In fact, it comes from somebody else's monastic life. Because becoming a monk or a nun, as well as being a lifelong business, it's not a self-help exercise. It's not something we sit down with a how-to book and figure out for ourselves. It's more like an apprenticeship. We learn from other people who are further down the path than we are ourselves. And obviously when we join the monastery, that means basically the novice master or mistress, the abbot or abbess, and the rest of the community. But as we continue in the life, once we've begun to put down our initial roots and receive, face-to-face help from people in that regard, then we can begin to find writers who serve the same function. And sometimes they can be modern. For me, that would be somebody like Father Michael Casey, a Cistercian monk from Australia, a monastery called Tarawara, who's written many books, which if you haven't read, you might. But the authors can also be ancient. And in the course of my own monastic life, I've received a lot of food for thought, prayer, reflection, and life, I guess, from those authors and their writings. One of the great joys for me, in fact, of being a Catholic is that there are basically 2,000 years, minus 10 years, I guess, of writing from all the corners of the world. From all the corners of the world and from a wide variety of different sorts of people. Monks, nuns, bishops, priests, lay people. Everything from kings and queens to ordinary folk like you and I. Apologies if you're less ordinary than I am. It's a very rich body of writings. All walks of life, all civilizations and countries, you name it. What's the advantage then of these older writings? Well, I guess that once writings get to a certain age, it becomes easier to see whether they've stood the test of time or whether in fact they were just a flash in the pan. Here today and gone tomorrow, a bit sort of ephemeral and less maybe significant for the spiritual life generally. It becomes easier to tell that from the distance of a certain time. I guess there's something helpful for me about the variety of the texts and the styles and the subjects. Different days call for different people, and we can usually find everything in what, in a not very modern way, tends to go under the name of the writings of the fathers of the church. A bit shorthand, clearly there are women writers too. Well, reading the Fathers, if we use that word just because it's short and sweet, can be many things. It can be rewarding, can be a real source of life, I guess, the spiritual life for sure. But it can also be daunting, it can be confusing, it can be boring, and so on. In a sense, it can be a bit like panning for gold. You can sometimes get the impression that there's a lot of rock coming off before you get the nugget of gold that you want. But still, that gold, to mix metaphors, I would want to suggest, is a bit like the pearl of great price. When we find it, we realize that the rest of the work was more than worth it. I guess I was speaking to somebody the other day, and they suggested that monasteries ought to be trying to introduce people to some of the teachings of the Fathers of the Church. And for all sorts of reasons, partly because I think that person was right, partly because it can be different to come up with a new topic every time you have to plan a home retreat. I thought that for the next several home retreats, if God spares me and Father Kevin asks me, it might be an idea to try to introduce people to various of the Fathers of the Church who have been helpful to me. Apologies in advance, because this means very much that you'll be listening to my spiritual playlist, but there it is. That's how it works. What should you aim to get from being introduced to some of the Fathers of the Church? I guess my answer is maybe something, maybe nothing. A few years ago, when I was still teaching in the school next door here, I helped out with a project whose aim was to distribute a short story, a different short story, and a poem, actually. I was less interested in the poems, each week to the students in a form that they might read, so basically electronically. And somebody asked me what the aim was and what success might look like. I said the aim was so that people would have an encounter with writers whom they may not otherwise have encountered. And success for me would be that one student would feel moved to read something else by an author that they'd discovered in this project and really would become great friends with that author. And I guess there's a similar aim here. It isn't, and I don't think it can be really, that everybody falls madly in love with every ancient writer. It's just not like that. It's very much horses for courses. It wouldn't be right for me to tell you who I can't stand in the Fathers of the Church, who I groan at when they come up in matins in the morning. But there are some people, and others where actually I'm always glad to hear what they've got to say, and very much when it's something new to me. I suppose my hope is that at least a few people will benefit from being introduced to the writings of people who have been important to me, maybe important to them too. And so we're starting off with St. Aelred of Rievaulx, I guess because it's close to home, at least to my home. St. Aelred comes from about 7 miles in that direction as a monk, Rievaulx. He was born in 1110, very much a 12th century person then, to a priestly family in Hexham. Priestly celibacy hadn't come in yet, although it clearly was coming in. And Aelred becomes a bit embarrassed that his father was a non-celibate priest, but there we are. There's a biography of St. Aelred written by one of his monks called Walter Daniel. You can probably find some notes of it online, or there is a version in Cistercian publications have published it. And many of the details of his life are in there. It's maybe enough for us now just to go through the rudiments. He was born in Hexham, as I said. He was probably taught in Durham, because later on he seems to have connections with some of the scholars there, particularly a monk called Lawrence of Durham. But he ended up as an official at the Scottish court, the court of the Scottish king. And obviously quite a high-ranking official, because he gets sent by the Scottish king down to York to go into some negotiations with the archbishop there. And this is when he discovers the community of Rievaulx, probably, though it seems that he may have had some dealings with the first abbot of Rievaulx, St. William, before that. And one of the stories, or legends anyway, is that he was driving down to York, probably past where we are, the main Billsdale Road as we call it, when he came to this very steep valley, at the bottom of which were some wooden huts and some monks wandering around, beginning the work on the construction of the abbey. And something caught him. something about the silence of the place, something about the attitude of the monks, something caught him. And he rode on to York and he had his meeting with the Archbishop. And then he came back. I think he may have stayed in Helmsley. My mind is a bit vague. At the castle there with Walter Lesbeck, who was the person who had given the monks at Rievaulx the land on which they were building the abbey. But basically he was caught. And to cut a long story short, he eventually joins that fledgling community. It must have been very different from the community that lived in the building whose ruins we now see there. Very early, quite small, still beginning to grow. Well, St. Aelred becomes a monk. There's obviously something very compelling about the quality of his monastic life, because he's then made the novice master, so he's responsible for forming new monks who join the Abbey of Rievaulx. Then Rievaulx had founded another abbey down in Lincolnshire called Revesby, and the monks there decided to elect Aelred from Rievaulx as their abbot. So he went down there as abbot for a while, and then the monks of Rievaulx got their own back, and later on, when the abbot died or resigned, I forget now, they decided to elect Aelred, who is currently abbot of Revesby, as their own abbot in the mother house at Rievaulx. And it's probably fair to say that Aelred's abbacy was a period of huge flourishing for Rievaulx, became an enormous community with hundreds of monks, and it had a particular reputation. It had the name of Mater Misericordiae, which is, Mother of Mercy. It comes in the Salve Regina, doesn't it? The Hail Holy Queen that we know. And that's probably no coincidence, because Our Lady is very important for the Cistercians. But it also says something about him and the way in which he approached the monastic life and his monks in particular. He's a curious character in many ways. He's extremely merciful, hence the title, Mater Misericordiae. It was like the community, they said, was a hen under the wings of which all the chicks came, and the brethren obviously came and took refuge. He was very merciful, compassionate, but also he has a very challenging and demanding teaching, which he somehow manages to make attractive. I guess because he's very good at making the connection between something which he's asking, which could be quite difficult, and actually where you're trying to get by that thing, which is a relationship with the Lord, which is infinitely worth it. Extremely good at putting that across. He's most known, I suppose, for a treatise on spiritual friendship. Not my favourite work, so certainly won't be discussing it this morning, but it is a good work and very accessible, and I'd recommend that people would read it. Another one which is more dear to me is called The Mirror of Charity, which I guess is really his understanding of what the monastic project is about for me, the individual monk. What's the point in being a monk, and what are we trying to achieve, and how do we achieve it? And charity, the love of Christ, of course, is that point. There are other treatises and some historical works, but by far the genre which is most represented in his output is sermons. Sometimes in the medieval period, things are put out in printed written form as sermons, but actually they weren't delivered as sermons originally. They're put in the form of a sermon. It's almost like a literary genre. And there are probably about 30 of St. Aelred's sermons which are on certain chapters of the book of Isaiah, which are in that form. It's basically a commentary which has been couched as sermons. But all of his other sermons, I think, reading them, have been preached to the brethren on various saints' days in the chapter. And like him, there's a curiosity to them. They can ask for difficult things, but they're also attractive. More than that, they're also perceptive. Aelred is very good at knowing human nature, and monastic human nature in particular, I guess because he knows it from the inside. And he can be very witty in the way that he can sort of poke fun at that, to try and diffuse some of the tensions, I suppose, that the weaker end of that nature can create in a community. It makes people laugh about some of the problems which arise and the things which cause them, but also shows them how to get through those problems. And I guess lastly for me, he's inspiring. He's an inspiring teacher. I thought we might just finish off. Admittedly, it's according to the numbers of pages, it's 3/5 of a talk, some finish. But I thought we might finish off with just looking at some passages of some sermons that I've found inspiring and I guess have been important for me. One of them is on the Gospel of Martha and Mary, which is a notoriously difficult gospel. And monks, when they're preaching on it, can tend to be a bit embarrassed about the bit when Jesus says that Mary, obviously the contemplative, if you like, has chosen the better part. And you get sort of homilies which sort of say, well, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And that's a pitfall. But this particular monk, St. Aelred, doesn't fall into that trap. He has what I think is the best interpretation of this parable. Probably worth reading some of it out and letting it speak for itself, because what he says about it is better than anything I might say. He talks about the home, if you like, the castellum, the castle in which these two women dwell, Mary and Martha, and he says this: "If therefore, brothers, our soul, as we have said, is like this home, it is important that two women dwell in it. One who sits at the feet of Jesus and listens to his word, the other who serves Jesus and feeds him. Notice, brother, if Mary alone were in this home, there would be no one to feed the Lord. If Martha were alone, there would be no one delighting in the words and presence of the Lord. Therefore, brothers, as long as Christ is poor and walks by foot on the earth and is hungry and thirsty and tempted, it is essential that both these women be in the one house. That is, that both these activities be in each soul." That last line is very interesting to me because, of course, in the Cistercian monasteries right up until the Second Vatican Council, there were two sort of classes of monk, really, the choir monks and the lay brothers. And we might have expected him to say, well, we need these two sorts of women in the same monastery, the Marys and the Marthas, the choir monks and the lay brothers, but he doesn't. Doesn't say that. He says that every person needs to have about them something of the Mary and something of the Martha. We need everything if we're going to serve Christ properly. Well, he knows that just like in the story, there can be pull between Mary and Martha. And so he goes on, I think, very perceptively recognizing that pull and just really putting it into words. He says, "It'll sometimes happen that Martha will want to have Mary with her at her work, but this must not be granted her. 'Lord,' she said, 'do you not care that my sister has left me to get on with this work alone? Tell her to help me.' This is a temptation. Notice, therefore, brothers, that when, during the time we should be at leisure for lectio and prayers, the thought occurs to us that we ought to go to this or that job, as if it were necessary. Then, as it were, Martha is calling to Mary to help her. But the Lord judges well and justly." And this is interesting. He doesn't order Martha to sit down with Mary, nor does he order Mary to get up and serve with Martha. Mary's role is certainly better and more pleasant and more delightful. Yet, he does not want Martha's task to be left undone on account of it. Martha's role is more laborious, yet he does not want Mary's to be disturbed. What he desires, therefore, is that both should do their own parts. We must surely do Martha's task at certain times, and at certain times Mary's task, unless there intervenes some necessity which knows no law. Clearly, strange things can crop up, can't they? And he says we're not talking about that, we're talking about day-to-day life. Therefore, we must punctiliously keep to those times which the Holy Spirit has determined for us. At the time of lectio, or prayer, I guess, we must stay still and quiet, not yielding to idleness or drowsiness, not departing from Jesus' feet, but sitting there and listening to his word. But, on the other hand, when it's time for work, we should be alert and ready, and on no account should we neglect the ministry of love in order to obtain quiet. We should never mix the one activity up with the other, unless obedience alone, to which we ought never to prefer quiet or work, action or contemplation, or any other things, compels us to leave, as it were, the very feet of Jesus. There's nothing sort of revolutionary there, is there? But he's very deft in the way that he gives voice to the subtle rationalizations that we as monks, and I guess anybody, oblates, others who are trying to follow in some way the rule of St. Benedict, people who are trying to live the spiritual life in general, can fall prey to. When we go to pray, suddenly we think there ought to be some work. When we go to work, we think, oh, I need prayer. And St. Aelred says, no, have a life which is balanced, have a life which is regulated with both elements set down, and in the monastery at least, where that's easier to achieve, stick to it. And unless something really catastrophic crops up, don't cave in to the things that your mind might try to tell you to do. Well, very briefly, there's another sermon. And in that sermon, it's for the Assumption, actually, and he talks about the suffering and the temptations that can come from the seeming absence of God in our prayer. Important, I think, that monks talk about that, because people think that monks live on a spiritual cloud nine, and they don't live on a spiritual cloud nine, and somehow they must therefore be quite inadequate. Well, we need to reassure people, I think, that we don't tend to live on spiritual cloud nine. We have all the problems in the spiritual life and difficulties that others have. And this is what St. Aelred says. It's quite upfront, it's blunt, it's honest. And I guess he was trying to encourage his brethren that he, the abbot, had these periods of dryness and difficulty, and so if they, the monks, did, they shouldn't be surprised about it, and they shouldn't lose hope. He's commenting on 2 verses of the book of Proverbs which say, "Who shall find a strong woman? And the heart of her man," the woman's man obviously, "trusts in her." For him, her, the woman, stands for the soul, because anima in Latin, the word for soul, is feminine. And Aelred asks, what sort of soul is it then? What sort of woman, in inverted commas, is it? Concerning which it can be said, the heart of her man, her husband, trusts in her. And he says, the man, God in other words, knowing his wife to be chaste, sober, modest, and accommodating, trusts in her. Confidently he goes out, and confidently he returns, knowing that whether he's absent or present, she will not let in any adulterers, listen to any debauchers, attend to any deceivers. Very sort of colourful in the language he uses. For she fears chastely, she loves perfectly. She loves her husband not for his possessions, but for his very self. She fears not being beaten, but being left, even for a little while. Already we're starting to get this notion of the desire for the presence of God, which is really at the heart of our spiritual lives as Christians, and is certainly key for all monks, and St. Aelred points it out there. Then he goes on about these times when the man seems to have gone out. He says, confidently he is absent, confidently he is present. But this spiritual man, how does he come and how does he go? He is everywhere, and he is never absent, because he is always and totally and everywhere present. It helps when this spiritual man is God, I suppose. But when we are worn down by various adversities, it is as though he takes leave. So he says that really it can be our own capacity for perceiving the presence of God which changes, not the presence of God. When we are worn down by various adversities, it is as though he takes leave. When we are consoled by prosperity, it is as though he returns. Then he talks about what that feels like to the soul when the man comes and goes, or seems to come and go. Many, when they are neither undergoing temptation, nor torn by adversity, nor afflicted by some molestation, exult and dance about and set themselves above others, as if they acquired this by their own merits. If, on the contrary, all these things befall them, difficulties obviously, they are saddened, feel overwhelmed, murmur and despair. Of such a soul it is not said, the heart of her man trusts in her. And this is a typical sort of colourful address from him. Well, brother, whoever you are who yesterday wept, prayed, experienced a great sweetness from God, know that he is your man because he was present. What did you promise your man? I will stand firm forever. Today, on the contrary, things are changed. Meditation is insignificant, prayer abhorrent, lectio contemptible. Moreover, lust attacks, the flesh burns, the mind is stirred up as if by the Furies. Your man is absent. Now let us see if it can be said of you, The heart of her man trusts in her. And he goes on and says something about how he thinks these sorts of souls should behave. If it does happen that you are visited by God's grace, infused with some heavenly sweetness, watered by a river of tears, diligently watch yourself, lest pride creep in, lest some inattentiveness insert itself into your other activities, lest you be remiss in abstinence, tepid in obedience, and above all, lest you judge to be inferior to yourself someone who you see not receiving a similar grace. For because of these inattentivenesses, grace is usually taken away, and a certain deterioration or tepidness comes to birth. So he says all of this comes from God. Don't think it comes from you, and hence don't set yourself above others if you think they're somehow less far on in the spiritual life than you are. And then lastly, he insists that even when we do experience the absence of God, we need to trust in God. It may be that we've done something, we've sinned against God, and on the theory that you can't kiss God on the cheek and kick him on the shin at the same time, God seems, if we've turned away from God, we won't be able to see God. God will be absent from us. But he says it's not necessarily for that reason, and God can make it happen to us that he seems to be absent for some providential purpose. And he says, when grace is withdrawn, if you remember that you have done any of these things, turned away from God in some way, well, never murmur against God, but humbly accusing yourself instead, manfully gird yourself to repair what has been damaged. True, if you are not conscious of having been remiss in any of these, never be unreasonably saddened by the withdrawal of grace, but as if you were about to receive the same grace again, be consoled by a sure hope. For the Lord teaches you insofar as you have humility in prosperity and perseverance in adversity. Again, we see there how realistic he is, how he can tell people what the real authentic experience of the monastic life is, and not some idealized picture that they might have brought into the monastery with themselves. He encourages them by saying that he's a sharer in the difficulties that they and all Christians have, but he also encourages them by telling them of the very great blessings which he has received in the monastic life, and often after the difficulties. He gives people hope. Well, you might think they were two very disparate and a bit odd sort of examples to choose, but it's difficult when somebody's got so many sermons, nearly 200, to come up with something that's more representative. Suffice to say, really, just to finish, that reading St. Aelred has been, to me, a great education in the monastic life. I've read a lot of his works, and I suppose, if anything, in the quotes that I've given this morning has set a fire in you, then I would encourage you to read him. If you wanted to read him, the places to start would probably be The Mirror of Charity and the Spiritual Friendship book that I mentioned previously. And after that, you could start on some of the sermons, all of which now I think are available in Cistercian publications, I'm afraid for a pretty penny. But they do repay reading. He's a great example for our time, and for me at least, a constant source of encouragement. Let's then give thanks to God for the example of St. Aelred and for his prayers for us now. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.